An organization is complacent in their obligations to protect their information. They have complacency in terms of how they are preparing for the possibility of a security breach and security incident. From a consumer perspective, I see a lot of complacency as the lack of appreciation of the data they're providing to these organizations, not appreciating the consents that they are providing or the agreements that they are agreeing to. So from a high level, I think that would be the number one
complacency.
risk.
Are there certain sectors that you worry about more than others? I mean, we talk about banking, we talk about media, we talk about healthcare, et cetera. Are there certain sectors, because of the type of data they have or intrinsically their focus on this, you worry about more or not? And give us an example or two. And if you can give us a name, that's great, but if you want to disguise the guilty here, you can do that.
Absolutely. So I would say that the organizations that face the greatest amount of threats are those that have the valuable information. We're talking financial data. They're the biggest targets for a lot of security incidents. But the problem is that they also recognize and appreciate the risk that they're facing. Where we see some organizations, like I mentioned in the complacency arena, are those that have sensitive information, but it's not the traditional credit card information, where they don't appreciate the risks that those organizations face. So the example that I would use would be an organization that, for example, provides web-based email, where they have a security breach of the usernames and passwords that they maintain. Now, normally if you have a free service where you're just giving out access to, here's a free webmail type of scenario, they're not necessarily appreciating the concerns and the risk of that data. And where we see that is the attackers recognize that that information is valuable. It's recognized that maybe the security precautions put in place on that data are not as high as, let's say, a banking website, but they know that if I can get the username and passwords for this information and I know how people operate, they use the same username and password across multiple sites. Now the attackers are leveraging those attacks against those companies that maybe don't have security in mind and using that data against different organizations that have more robust security.
Stacey?
I see that healthcare is one of the biggest targets, but that's because there's so much personal data in there, and you gather that information and you can then attack the individuals as well as the hospitals attempting to shut down, the equipment in the hospital, which we've seen in recent years. But also the utilities. They don't believe that they're open to the public, and they have been attacked recently. We've seen it in several municipalities in Alaska recently, where they were shut down. The entire municipality was shut down because they had security holes that they did not believe were there. And you shut down an entire municipality and you have no emergency services, you have no health services, and you come to a standstill. Right? I'm seeing that.
In the spirit of technology, do you see promising young new ventures that on a predictive basis, on an offensive basis, can identify where these risks occur? Or candidly, you've got to be less complacent, you've got to react to stuff more quickly, et cetera, more hygiene oriented?
I think that what we're seeing is the younger people coming in who are just fresh out of school. They look at things a little bit differently and bring a fresh perspective, but you need to marry that with the people who have the experience to close up the all those holes. I use the word holes all the time because there's little gaps in security, and those little gaps are a big problem. And you see a lot of people now, social networking. It's the way everybody communicates with everybody else. But that's a big data leak, is social networking. You're putting all your information out there. The threat actors go and use that. And with that information, they can come in and target specific people in a company as opposed to just targeting the company. But you also see constant bombardment out there. It's brute force attacks, constantly bombarding everything that's connected to the internet. It's random. It's just out there. They're trying to find a place to get in.
Yep.
And once they get in, they expand on that.
Stacey, let me just stay with this point about social networks. There was a scathing article written yesterday in the New York Times about Facebook and about their response to a lot of the privacy issues and fake news issues, et cetera, and said that the company was more focused on protecting its image than it was really solving root cause. What is your view on all that?
Well, I didn't read the article, so
It's a good read.
I will have to do that. But I think one of the biggest problems is companies don't want to own up to the problem once they've been breached. They're trying to protect themselves and their PR. I think it would be better for companies like that, such as Facebook, is the moment you know that something has happened, go public. Don't try and hide it. And I think that's the biggest problem is everyone wants to hide it. And because of that, it looks like you're trying to cover things up and you're not being transparent. And the world around you sees that and looks at you in a different light.
Scott?
That's an interesting point. When we're doing these investigations, there is constantly internal pressure. There is a desire in most of my clients that they want to notify as soon as they can. They want to go out public. The problem is, and what I think that sometimes is not fully recognized, is that, first of all, there are incidents that happen all the time. Here at Baker Hostetler, we do statistics in terms of what we're seeing in our annual data report. And we see that from a statistic perspective, we only notify in almost 30% of breach investigations because the vast majority of those incidents don't involve the theft or unauthorized access to that information. So the danger of notifying right away, right off the bat, is that you may be in a situation where no information was really exposed. Maybe they attempted to get in but didn't access the data where the information was actually housed, or there's no evidence of data exfiltration. And that does take some time. I know we're going to talk about the GDPR, which has a 72-hour kind of notification component to it. And that is just not a reasonable or practical amount of time to do an investigation once you learn of an incident. At 72 hours, you're still figuring out what happened. And so there is this kind of, like I said, this competing pressures to notify. Most of my clients, when we have discussions, they know that they're going to have to notify and they want to do that, but they want to be not only protect the organization, but they be accurate in what they're saying. So you don't want to just say to somebody, hey, we had a security breach. We don't know what happened. We don't know if your information's impacted, but we just want to let you know about it. I mean, A, that would happen all the time, and B, that would cause some apprehension. I mean, when my information is impacted, do I need to freeze my credit? Do I need to, what steps should I take? And if you notify kind of that, oh, we just wanted to be transparent about the process, you end up creating more concern for the affected individuals.
Yeah, so how do you take that decision about when to disclose and when you don't?
It is a case-by-case basis. But from a legal perspective, we have a phrase that says, let the forensics drive the decision making. So when do you have something that is not going to change, that is solid in terms of your conclusions? And the case example that I like to use is the situation with Target. If you remember Target back in 2014, originally they came out and they said, 40 million people were affected, and it was this credit card information, but don't worry, your PIN numbers weren't impacted. That statement, first of all, was not derived based on solid forensic findings, because we know as they eventually did their investigation, they learned more information was impacted. I think it was up to like 100 million, and include personal information. And then not only that, but the initial conclusion that PIN numbers weren't impacted. A, they didn't need to go out with that information. I think that they had a desire to provide a positive spin, but that wasn't the basis of solid forensic evidence. But by going out and having that statement, they actually had to issue another notice because that information wasn't accurate. So they issued a second notice that said, oh yes, PIN numbers were impacted, but they were encrypted. And yet they wouldn't have had to do that if they hadn't made that initial incorrect statement at the beginning.
And they ultimately lost their CEO over this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, not just the CEO, but a number of other members of their employees.
We know what rolls downhill, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's go into privacy a little bit more because you've mentioned GDPR. Tell us a bit more about GDPR versus the California proposed kind of privacy regulation. How do they differ, and what's your view on both?
Well, that's a topic for, that could be a couple-hour presentation all by itself, the differences between the two. From a high level, the GDPR component of it is kind of the European privacy law. It applies to information collected on those European citizens, and it gives them certain rights regarding the access of their information, the right to be forgotten, and certain consent requirements that are more rigorous than here in the US currently. Now the California Consumer Privacy Act, which was just passed, amended, and is going to go into effect in January of 2020, has very similar provisions. It not only includes certain rights that consumers have to access their data and delete their data, but it also gives those consumers certain private rights of actions against companies who have data breaches. So they're both very, very similar, although they have some very fundamental differences. But both of them are focused on kind of the rights of the consumer, notifying them and requiring companies to disclose what they're doing with their data.
Yep. Stacey?
I can only say that I agree with what Scott said.
Yeah.
He's got a little bit more information on this than I do. But privacy and security are two different things that work together. In order to protect your privacy, you need to have the security. And privacy, to me and to a lot of people, has to do with all of their personal information. And when you're talking about personal information, it's not just, name and address, but social security numbers, passport numbers, driver's license, your medical information. It all falls into personal information that needs to be protected. And I think we're doing a much better job at protecting that.
Yep.
That privacy.
Let me drill down on this issue on GDPR. On one side, and I guess going to ask your view on which side you fall, has it improved privacy? Has it improved security? Or on the other side, in the media panel that was before this late morning, there was a very interesting comment saying that small companies are being disadvantaged by GDPR. They don't have the resources to comply with all the things that are necessary. And many of those companies, as Scott Brady shared earlier, those small companies are innovators. They're trying to create new services that benefit consumers, et cetera. Where do you come out on it? Is GDPR adding more value? Or are you saying, no, it's actually just created an additional level of burden?
So I may be biased in this area, but I feel that the GDPR has added a certain level of overly burdensome to a lot of organizations. It's very expensive to comply with those regs, and there are significant ramifications if you don't. We're talking major fines and penalties that could potentially be levied against you. So but from a privacy perspective, it's a good thing because it does the idea of consent to the individuals, the idea to be able to know where your data, I think is a very positive aspect of it. I think that it is, at least on GDPR, it can be a little bit burdensome. On the security aspect of it, the security, kind of the hammer is the fines and penalties. So organizations are, in some cases, reluctant to collect that information or reluctant to go into new lines of business because of these massive threats of fines and assessments, at least on the GDPR side. The CCBA side is also have a certain level of burdensome requirements. I think not as much as the GDPR. But for example, there are certain ways in which you cannot distinguish or discriminate against the collection of data. And the example I'll use it is under the CCPA is you have to give people the ability to opt out of the sale of their personal information. Now, there are some businesses on the internet, quite a few, that are free to the consumer by virtue of the fact of they sell that information externally, or they use targeted ad-based interest-based advertisements, and that provides a benefit to those consumers. It's an innovative product, and in many cases, it's a new business front. And I feel like both under the GDPR and under CCPA, some of those business models are going to be jeopardized, and entrepreneurs are going to take a look at those laws and say, you know what, this new idea of a business is just too risky because of the fines and penalties associated with it.
Yep. Any stats, by the way, on the % of people that opt out of sharing their information? And all these disclosures now we're getting, you have to say, I agree, et cetera. What % are saying, I'm worried and I'm not going to share my information?
You know what, that's at least, so the CCPA hasn't gone into effect yet, so we're talking just on the GDPR side. And from my clients who've kind of experienced that, most people just ignore it. They just, accept, and they kind of gloss over it, which is why when I was talking about complacency on the individual side, they're not appreciating of what they're disclosing, what they're authorizing these companies to do, despite the fact that all these laws and regulations say, tell us exactly what you're doing with my data. I mean, most people don't read the terms and conditions. Most people will get those emails, say, I just want to log into Facebook. I'm just going to press accept. I mean, how many of you have gone to a website and they have a little banner at the bottom that says, we have cookies, and you accept the use of the cookies? I mean, it just becomes automatic at some point.
Absolutely. Stacey, your view?
It is definitely automatic. Nobody reads through those long disclosures. Everybody just scrolls to the bottom and clicks OK or I agree, and you're giving up your right to privacy. You're giving away everything. They can collect whatever they want because you've just agreed to it without knowing what you're agreeing to. I'm as guilty as anybody. I do the same thing. I don't want to read through all of that. And I just scroll to the bottom and click.
Yeah.
We all need to be a little more careful with that.
Yeah. Let me now ask, obviously one of the big areas of focus of the conference are the leadership imperatives. Everybody here is a leader or aspiring leader, et cetera. What is your advice, Stacey? I want to start with you. What is the number 1 or 2 things you would advise people as leaders here in this whole area?
Well, one thing I would advise is for your network, for your entire environment, have an outside consulting company come in and do a review of your environment and give you a report that shows you this is the security you have in place, this is what you should add into it, here's your high level risks and your medium and low level, and have an outside team work with your internal team. You set up, you have an IT group in there, set up everything, and they believe they've covered all your security. They believe that there are no gaps, and if you have somebody come in and show them where they have gaps, most of the time it's something small. Occasionally it's something large. But another issue is with your security, you're opening up by allowing people to bring in their personal devices. You're opening up that network right there. If they bring in their personal device and plug that in, what if there's malware on that? What kind of security do you have on that personal device? And the big corporations or the small companies, they don't filter that security down to that little, that personal device, and that's a big gap that needs to be filled.
Yep. And Scott, I'm going to go to you. Any of you that have questions, please come up to the microphone and we'll take audience questions. Scott, you're...
So I would say for the entrepreneurs, for the future leaders, what you have to do is you have to understand this arena. You have to understand cybersecurity. It is imperative as a leader, as a high functioning member of any organization, a CEO needs to understand operations, marketing, finance, HR. They have to have all of these different skill sets. And while they don't need to be a high-level expert on cybersecurity like myself or like Stacey, they do need to know the acronyms. They need to know the common threats against the organization, because it's essential. It's part of the job function now. And we see this not only in CEOs, but we see it in various companies who are exposed to liability. They need to establish that they are taking security seriously. And if you have executives who basically don't know anything about security and they say, oh, I do all paper and pencil. I mean, that's great and all, but you are causing a severe disservice to the organization. So my advice is learn about cybersecurity, learn about the risks facing the organization, because this is something that affects every company.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no company out there that does not have a risk of cybersecurity. And if you say, hey, I operate a farm and I'm not at risk, well, I guarantee you there's something that you have. If you have employees, you have their personal information. You are at risk. So there's really no organization that's not that shouldn't be concerned with cybersecurity.
And it's not just threat of disservice; it's threat of loss of job too, right? We've already seen that happen, and boards have got legal liability, et cetera.
Absolutely.
Let's take the question in the back there. Yeah.
With respect to utilities, I know with our country's deteriorating infrastructure, how do you mitigate the risk with respect to utilities?
How do you mitigate the risks? It's all about the security that you put in and separating different aspects of the utilities. You don't want everything being controlled by the same servers, and you don't want you want to have a split between them so that this area controls over here, this area controls over here. Don't let those two talk to each other. Anything that's open to the internet is at risk. So things that don't have to be open to the internet, controlling the water, the power, it doesn't have to be open to the internet, so block it off completely. Not just from the internet, but from your internal systems.
Good, yes.
So when it comes to accepting terms and conditions on websites and apps, so as you said, we just skip all of that and we just accept it. But what is the alternative? If you don't accept it, they do not give you access to their services or their websites. Is there any solution to this?
I'm going to let Scott.
So on the terms and conditions side, I know that what's contemplated under the CCPA, which again hasn't gone into effect yet, is that you can't discriminate against somebody who decides not to opt out of the selling of their personal information. So that idea of opting out and yet still having access to those services, or being able to access it based off of a reasonable value of what your personal data might be worth. So just by virtue of example, let's say your personal information is worth $10 to the company. If you pay $10 a month, you can opt out and yet still have access to the service. So some of those are contemplated under the CCPA. I'd be interested to see how that actually plays out once it goes into effect. But as of right now, I mean, that's kind of the only alternative on the kind of the business side. On the personal side, I think, like I mentioned, the consumers, I think, over time have become more, some of them are, of course, jaded and don't pay attention, but I feel like there is a movement where people are recognizing that in many cases they're the product, that their personal information is the valuable thing, and the fact that they're using a website for free is the trade-off there. So consent and disclosure are all very good, but until they recognize what they're doing and what the disclosures they're making, that's really going to be the fundamental change there.
Good. Thank you. Yeah, in the back there.
How do companies choose between on-prem infrastructure versus a cloud?
From my perspective, I don't see, I think there are real values in having it be cloud-based. There's cost efficiencies there, sometimes in which case you can leverage the resources of a hosting platform of some sort. So in reality, for my clients, I ask them what will fit best for their needs. And I'm not one of the ones that says, well, don't do cloud because it's, you know, all this information at risk. You're still going to be at risk if it's on-prem. It's just a matter of now you're also responsible for securing and maintaining it. So in reality, a lot of the threats, because of the interconnected nature of these networks, are going to be the same across environments. So if you can appreciate those risks and make sure that it fits for your organization, then I don't see an issue with the cloud versus the on-prem type of environment. Now, there are some regulatory issues associated with that, and for example, there are some companies where they say, well, you must house all of our data in the US. And in that situation, if your cloud provider can't, you know, agree to those terms, then you need to do something on-prem. Alternatively, there are also situations where, like for example, the big cloud providers like Amazon and Microsoft, you may have contract provisions or indemnification language you want in your contracts that Microsoft just won't agree to, or Amazon just not going to agree to because you don't have the leveraging, negotiating leverage to get them to change those. So in those situations, if you really want to control it, then you may have to move it on-prem. But in terms of the threats, I feel like they're the same.
I would agree. The threats are the same. We see the breaches in both on-prem and the cloud. In either case, you need to make sure that your security is in place. In the cloud, you're going to have to deal with your vendor and make sure that they put the right security in place. If it's on-prem, you're still going to have to deal with a vendor, whoever is putting that, you know, providing you with that software. The risk really doesn't change between on-prem and the cloud.
Okay, let's take a final question up here.
Obviously, the security issues from the internet just grow exponentially as the internet expands. So I wanted to ask each one of you on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being very secure and 10 not. You spoke about the gaps and the complacency and so forth. I wanted to know, just at this point in time, the U.S. overall, whether it's government services, utility, private sector, and even just individual home computers, where are we on a vulnerability of being secure? And I'm very confident this is going to become a maturing industry and we'll have more lawyers and more senior directors in this space. But at this point in time, how vulnerable is the U.S. relative to where we were and where we're going? Thank you.
Well, I don't think we're nearly as vulnerable as we were. I think security has come a long way. I don't know, I can't pinpoint a number for you, sorry. But I think as the internet changes and grows, we have to grow with it. And I think we do. And it's just a matter of keeping on top of it.
I don't think I can quantify it either, and it's not necessarily because I don't have my own opinions on what number might fit, but in reality, security is not a state. It's not you're secure, you're not secure. Security is a process, and it's a matter of identifying the risks of the organization, mitigating those risks, and then reevaluating. So it's an ongoing, and those threats that face those systems change. I will use a case in point. We've had electric voting systems for a while, and yet the amount of attacks against those have escalated in recent years. And so now we've recognized those threats, we've appreciate those, and now they're moving more towards focusing on some of those. So same thing with utility systems. We, in many cases, there are a lot of our utilities which were vulnerable to hacking. And it took one, I think there was a couple in Europe where some hackers took over a power plant and shut it down to kind of, be that trigger point where we suddenly now, oh my gosh, this is actually a major threat. This can have some major issues. And so all of a sudden now they're refocusing on that. So security, it's an ongoing process and it evolves based on the threats. I think that as more and more of our society utilizes that data, I think that there's going to be even more threats. It's going to jeopardize how that state is going to be. So Didn't quite answer your question, but it's a difficult one. So.
Let me just, in closing, tying to that last question, which I think was a very interesting one, that my general read of what you've said is the challenge is going to continue. There's more and more data out there. It is going to become a big issue. Number two, we all have responsibilities as leaders here. We've already seen evidence of that in the past. There's regulation that is coming that we need to, it's already here and more coming potentially. This is a real issue, and for all the great innovation, if this doesn't get addressed, it's a big concern. I just want to thank Scott, you and Stacey for really raising the level of awareness on a critical issue, and thanks to all of you for good questions.